Please welcome to the stage, Dean Karen Yarhi-Milo.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of SIPA and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. On behalf of SIPA and the Institute of Global Politics Women's Initiative, it is my great honor and privilege to welcome all of you to our event commemorating the 30th anniversary of the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge recent events at Columbia that you are likely reading and hearing about. On Friday, we learned that we are facing major reductions in federal grants that support critical, scholarly, and scientific research. And over the weekend, a member of our SIPA community was detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. These are very difficult times for this university and for this community. University leaders at the highest levels are working on these issues all day, every day. In fact, that is why I may have to depart shortly after making these remarks. But let me underscore, we will never abandon our mission, our values, our principles in the face of current attacks, challenges, and uncertainty. We will forge ahead, committed to educating and supporting all of our students, advancing the vital work of our faculty, inviting the open and free exchange of ideas, protecting the freedom to exercise our academic mission without fear, and our commitment to engaging with the world as we seek to solve its most pressing problems. Neither SIPA nor Columbia can survive without these commitments. On that note, we gather today to mark a watershed moment in the history for women's rights. Representatives from nearly 200 countries and tens of thousands of women's activists gathered in Beijing in 1995 to call for gender equality. And Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton famously proclaimed, yes, what did she famously proclaim? That human rights, women's rights, and women's rights are, exactly, once and for all, which became a rallying cry for women around the world. 189 nations unanimously adopted the landmark Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is still the most comprehensive blueprint for gender equality to this day. The conference inspired women from all over the world, including women in this audience, to bring Beijing back home and implement reform in their domestic and foreign policies and press for action from their governments. Progress was made in many areas. Yes, we are reminded daily that progress is neither inevitable nor irreversible. We are seeing a growing backlash against women's rights as illiberal governments look to reverse decades of gains. And 21st century challenges, including the rise of online abuse and harassment, the threat of climate change, and increased conflict, are new obstacles to gender equality. Now, research from scholars here at SIPA and others around the world demonstrates that advancing gender equality is not just a moral imperative, it is also a strategic one. Data shows that women's participation in the economy stimulates economic growth, and women's political participation makes countries more stable and more secure. Today, we will reflect on this strategic imperative and the transformative impact of the Beijing Conference. We will hear from history-making leaders who were there, featuring young activists at the forefront of the women's movement, and we will offer lessons from the world leaders on how to move forward in time of regression. I want to recognize our partners for today's convening: Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, GWL Voices, Vital Voices, and Wellesley College. Thank you, Milan, Susanna, and Maria Fernanda, Alice, and Paula for making these critical conversations happen. Thank you. And really, there is no one who deserves more recognition than Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, who has dedicated her life to advancing the rights and opportunities for women and girls around the world, and whose words at the Beijing Conference 30 years ago catalyzed a global movement for gender equality. Thank you, Secretary Clinton, for all you have and continue to do to move us forward. This event is our second public event hosted by the IGP Women's Initiative since gender policy experts Jennifer Klein and Rachel Vogelstein, they're here, since they join our SIPA community. Thank you, Jen and Rachel, for your leadership. This event exemplifies the purpose of the Women's Initiative to bring together practitioners, scholars, and activists from across the globe to forge solutions to advance women's full and equal participation in society. And I want to close by recognizing the late Ann Kaplan, trustee emerita of Columbia University and a founding donor and advisory chair to the IGP Women's Initiative, who brought to us her vision and commitment to gender equality, and had for many years been really a true leader in this work at the university, and many of her Columbia's friends and partners are here today. So I want to thank you all. We promise we will carry Anne's memory with us. We carry her memory with us every day, and it resonates in the room this afternoon. We miss her, we honor her, and we extend our deepest gratitude to the members of her family who are in the audience, her husband Robert and her son Andrew. And now, to introduce our first panel, I welcome to the stage Yasmin Erga, Senior Lecturer in International Public Affairs and the longtime Director of SIPA Specializations on Gender and Public Policy. Yasmin, the floor is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Karen, for the introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. As Dean Yarhi Milo said, no moment in the recent history of the contemporary women's movement is as important as the Beijing Conference. 3 other UN Women's Conferences preceded, one every 5 years since 1975. And of course, each one of those conferences was important. But it was at Beijing that Secretary Clinton then declared, human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights once and for all. And it was truly as if a bell had rung at the same moment all over the globe. It's the equation of human rights and women's rights, of course, that is the substance of that message. But it is that once and for all that I think is the primary message. We were impatient then, we are impatient now, and that I consider a virtue. The Beijing Conference produced a platform for action, and more importantly, it led to the Beijing Settlement, the general agreement that equality and the end of discrimination and women's empowerment were shared universal goals. It has, of course, been continuously contested, but the horizon had been defined: men and women are equal. The genius of Beijing was threefold. First, the results of the conference were condensed in a platform and not a treaty, so that even countries reluctant to sign binding human rights agreements, like the United States, could choose to be part of it and could be called upon to support it. Secondly, it integrated the voices of grassroots women who had come together in a nearby village from all over the world. And so the UN conference at Beijing went from being an affair characterized by what I would call institutional feminists, women whom their governments were willing to include in delegations, to integrating a more social movement aspect. And finally, it was based on the explicit acknowledgement that actual equality was, and I'm sorry to say, is today nowhere to be found, and that this was not accidental. Rather, it reflected social orders, disparate though they might be in every part of the world, all of which required a transformation for women's rights to be human rights and human rights to be women's rights. The past, Beijing told the world, was prologue, not destiny. Today, many would like our past to be our future. They turn to sovereignty so as to object to human rights. They put multilateralism on the defensive. They ask not how equality should be understood and attained, but rather why it matters at all. I find it hard to believe that we will answer that it matters not at all, but that is indeed a question before us. The dice, I think, have been rolled, but they have not yet landed. Beijing gave us the institutional and normative framework that enables us, or that can enable us, to ensure that the past remains prologue and not destiny. This history is not over. And that is thanks to the women of Beijing, whose lives were transformed because they were there, and who have continued to transform the world. I'm honored to introduce them today. So let me just briefly introduce you all, and I apologize if I mispronounce some names. Ruchira Gupta, Emmy-winning journalist and founder of the anti-sex trafficking app, Apne App, who attended the Beijing Conference and who as a member of civil society. Elise Nelson, president and CEO of Vital Voices Global Partnership, who was 21 years old in Beijing. That's what's called foresight. Musu sorry for the mispronunciation, our Cambodian human rights activist and exiled politician, who chaired the Coalition of Cambodian Women for Beijing, raised funds for 115 grassroots women to attend the Beijing Conference, where she launched a project called Women Weaving the World Together. And Milan Verveer, who I'm so pleased to see here again, Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, the first ever US Ambassador at Large for global women's issues. Milan was assistant to the President and Chief of Staff to then First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, and helped to plan the US delegation to the Beijing Conference. The conversation will be moderated by Maria Fernanda Espinosa, Executive Director of GWL Voices and President of the 73rd session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Thank you all. And let me give the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much. I really like the energy in this room, I have to say. Thank you to SIPA, and thank you to all the partners that made this gathering possible. So I'm privileged to be moderating this conversation with 4 women that have many things in common, but I would just highlight 2 things in common. They're powerful, they're wise, trailblazers, they transform every day, and they do good, to build better and more equal societies. That's number 1. And number 2 is that they were all in Beijing 30 years ago. And I'm sure, especially for the younger part of the audience, very curious to know what happened in Beijing, in the corridors, in the hallways, and behind the scenes, but in the front line as well.
In the rain.
Huh?
In the rain.
In the rain in Beijing. And I would like to really start with you, Melan. You were in Beijing, and please take us a little bit, behind the scenes, especially for our younger student population in this audience. And I'm sure many of you were not even born 30 years ago.
That's true.
So we heard already that you helped plan the U.S. delegation to Beijing as Chief of Staff of Secretary Clinton. And you were in the Hall of Nations. You were there. So tell us a little more about the significance of the conference. Why was it a transformative moment in the global movement for women's rights? Bring your brain 30 years ago and tell us.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back here at SIPA. Thank you, Dean Karen, obviously our dear Secretary Clinton, who made all of this possible, certainly my going to Beijing. But also Maria Fernanda, thank you, because she was president of the General Assembly at one point. There have only been 4 in the history of the United Nations, so a trailblazer with us as well. Let us declare from this day forward for all the world to hear that women's rights are human rights are women's rights, once and for all. And it was those words that echoed around the world coming out of the Beijing Women's Conference. It was a conference, as you heard, that followed 3 other world conferences on women. And there was a determination to really ensure gender equality. And at this point, hard for people to believe, I know, because it sounds, what's the big deal? Women are human, women's rights are human rights, right? No. Gender-based violence was not considered a violation of human rights. Human trafficking was not considered in that category, nor were so many other violations that you know. And Secretary Clinton, then First Lady, was determined, as she said to those of us who were working with her, I want to push the envelope as far as it will go in what I say. And there were not great expectations for her speech. There was back and forth as to whether she would even get to go to Beijing. There was a whole organized right-wing movement, much of which you hear echoed today because they have not stopped, which said, oh no, this conference is going to destroy the family. It's going to create 5 genders. We cannot have the First Lady of the United States go. We had the human rights community say she shouldn't go, the human rights community, because it was taking place in China, and we know what China represents. But for those women who were toiling on human rights, they were determined that she go. And there were so many other barriers. And when we got on the plane to take off, the press was eager to know, the press that traveled with us, what is she going to say? We heard from our press corps in the White House, from the head of the White House press, that she really wasn't going to say anything. She wasn't going to rock the boat. Strange that he could say that when nobody had seen this speech. And there was a determination that this speech not go out far and wide across the State Department or other government leaders because the end result would be mush. And we didn't want it, and she, of all people, wanted it to be a strong statement. And when she stood up in this cavernous hall that had delegations from all over the world, many who had toiled for years in this field, and she said, what is happening on domestic violence, what happens in the home, what happens in war, conflict-related sexual violence, human trafficking, killing girl babies just because they're born girls, dowry burnings, honor killings. And after each one of these, she said, this is a violation of human rights. And you looked out at the group, and I can tell you, UN audiences don't emote much emotion, ever. And all of a sudden, honor killings, you could see people from the Middle East standing up and beginning to understand. Dowry burnings, South Asia, standing up and feeling, this is about us. One of the most powerful people in the world came and said and validated what we've been doing, working to say this is human rights and these rights need to be protected. And as you heard, there was a platform for action, a declaration and a platform for action that was adopted. It had 12 articles, adopted by consensus, unheard of, would never happen today in the current climate. And among these articles were these rights: the right to an education, the right to health care, the right to participate in the economy of your country, the right to run for political office, the right to be free from violence, the right to be free from discrimination. And just showing the prescience of all of this, the environment was an article, before we even were uttering the words climate change. There were so many components to this that mattered so much. And you know, and even armed conflict, many of us have been working for years on women, peace, and security. 5 years after this platform was adopted, the UN adopted that resolution. And so this was about what we were going to do going forward collectively. And at the same time all of these people were meeting in Beijing, there was an NGO forum that took place in Huairou. And it wasn't supposed to be in Huairou, but the Chinese were getting very, very nervous. And there were tens of thousands of people going to show up in China for this conference. And so they pushed it out farther away. And Secretary Clinton was determined to get to Huairou as a show of support for all these extraordinary people, and they were in Huairou. And it was pouring rain, as Elise said. We got there. There was extraordinary disappointment because thousands and thousands of people wanted to hear from her. And over the loudspeaker, you kept hearing, this is the fault of the Americans. This is, yeah, we made the rain come down. This is the fault of the Americans. That's why you can't get in. And she did give her speech. It was in a much smaller room. But people pressed. One of them will tell you about it, I'm sure, that very young person who was there at the time. But what happened from all of this? It sparked a movement. It rekindled this commitment to go forward and to ensure once and for all that women's rights were human rights. And when we came back from Beijing, there was a determination, as President Clinton said right before we left. He created an interagency council on women because he wanted all the good ideas, he said, to come back to the United States and be part of what we were going to do. And that indeed happened. We had a whole operation once we got back, focusing on everything from microcredit to childcare, really ahead of the agenda of even where the United States was in many ways. And there was a determination on the part of our First Lady that this speech was not to be about just the elites, just people who didn't even know what was this about, but that it would be representative of all Americans, and particularly American women. And to that end, the delegation was purposefully organized so that we would have the widest representation. We had a Muslim physician. We had a nun who was the president of a university. We had a male. This was about men, too, gender equality. He was the former governor of New Jersey. We had a Republican woman who was the editor of a major women's magazine, and on, spanned generations and spanned the sector, just as the representation in Wairo in those tens of thousands spanned geographies and spanned ages. And we were individually transformed. Each of us came back committed in a way that we had not been committed when we started. And this movement was transformed, and these issues were transformed in a way that we all recognized would improve the world dramatically if we could achieve the goals.
Thank you, Milan. It really felt, we were all there. We were all there. In what struck me of the story you told with so much passion is that international agreements are useful, especially after you come back, especially when you translate both the Declaration and the Platform for Action into real work, real policy, real political commitment. And that's what stays at the end. So thank you indeed. In Beijing, 189 governments met in Beijing, but more importantly, 30,000 delegates from civil society in Wairo. And one of the souls that was there shining is called Ruchira. Ruchira, you were there, you were in Wairo during the conference. So tell us, what was it like? The rain, the cold, in how, this moment really shaped your commitment, your activism in the global women's movement. It's a privilege to have you here. You have the floor. I'm just so worried about the time. Oh, thank you. That was Secretary Clinton saying that, okay?
That's solidarity.
So now I'm much more relaxed because I'm just so eager to hear all the details. So you have the floor, Ruchira.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda, and thank you, Milan, for walking us down the journey and reminding us of everything we've achieved. Because very often in today's time, we feel daunted or we feel helpless. And the Beijing Women's Conference and taking stock and celebrating it right now shows us that we have made strides, we have achieved so much. As you said, that at that time, we didn't even think about saying women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. But today we take it for granted. We did not take it for granted at that time. We did not think domestic violence was a crime in many countries. We thought it was a private matter and people would not interfere. Most countries now have laws against domestic violence. And I remember standing in a tribunal about domestic violence and listening to that in Wairo. I also remember that I understood for the first time that civil society, government leaders, policy makers, NGO leaders could actually work together, collaborate, and come up with a platform for action which countries would take seriously. I didn't know that till I showed up there. At that time, I was a journalist, and I was in the middle of making a documentary on trafficking about missing girls from Nepal who ended up in the brothels of Mumbai. And some friend told me that all these women are getting together in Beijing, and do you want to come? And I said, of course. I didn't have the language, I didn't have the vocabulary, I didn't know a strategy, I just went. And there I was in Wairo, and I heard the word sex trafficking, human trafficking for the first time. And suddenly I had a framework for what I was doing, what I was documenting. And I suddenly began to also meet other women leaders. I probably met Elise. I know I met Milan. I did hear Mrs. Clinton, standing in the rain, sharing an umbrella with another NGO leader in Huairou, squashing in to try and understand what was being said, and then the room lighting up. And then standing in line for a taxi to go back to Beijing to see if I could get into one more session, and wondering how I would do it when another woman said, I think you want to go somewhere very quickly, take my spot. So I understood solidarity. I heard many languages and many clothes people wore from different countries and cultures, and it was kind of exciting to see it all happen in one space, because very often we forget what it means for women to come together, but it really did make a difference, because though the languages were different, we were all speaking the same language. We had achieved something, and suddenly there was an articulation of that, and we wanted to do more. In my own work, I began to see and make friends with people who were working on sex trafficking. I had vocabulary, now I had friends and allies. And then I went back to India and Nepal and finished my documentary. A year later, when I won the Emmy, it was Donna Shalala who gave me the award. And when I was on stage, and this has to go back to Beijing, because I turned to her and I said, just getting the award is not enough, can you help me do more? And she said, what? And I said, I want to use the award to make a difference. I want to change laws in the UN. I want to change laws in the US. And can you help me do it? And I wouldn't have had the courage or even the imagination to know that I could do that if I had not been in Beijing and heard Hillary Clinton say women's rights are human rights, and then see it translated into action, as Milan said, become the President's Interagency Council for Women. Then it led to the creation of the Trafficking in Persons Office. And Donna Shalala helped me connect again with Milan and Mrs. Clinton, and through going and testifying in the Senate, we actually pushed for a law which is now the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which led to the creation of the Trafficking in Persons Office. It led me to think about what NGOs are. I went back with the documentary to my own country and set up an NGO called Apne Aap to work on sex trafficking, helped thousands of women, and still kept connecting with country after country to see what other change could we do. Think bigger, but think more collaboratively. And also I learned, and this is for all the students in the room, that never give up. Secondly, when you do something, you don't know if it's big or small, but you have to do it as if it matters, and only time will show. Because things I thought were very big and consequential, nothing came of it. And just going to Beijing and meeting people, I had no idea that one day I would be sitting on stage and Mrs. Clinton would be sitting in the audience listening to me. But it's happened. And this is how change happens. So with these words, because I can go on and on talking about the atmosphere, the excitement in Huairou. It was rainy, it was difficult, we had to go back and forth between Beijing and find money to pay for taxis if we missed the bus, but we learned so much from each other, and those friendships are lifelong. Like now when I meet Elise, I feel I've known her for years, mm-hmm. and I have known her. Actually we have, exactly. So this is how it is, and friendships matter. What also matters is that you have to listen to people. In Beijing, the platform also provided us a chance to listen to each other, and that became this big volume, which is now a movement for women's rights. So we can't stop, we have to go forward.
Thank you, Ruchira. Very, very inspiring indeed. We have to think big and act collectively, and there is only one language, the language of solidarity. We heard you, really very, very touching. And let me now turn to Sokua. You were also in Beijing, of course, and I'm told by some, voices that when you heard Secretary Clinton's phrase, "Women's rights are human rights," in her speech, you made a decision to run for public office. And subsequently, you became a member of the Cambodian parliament. So it was a life-changing moment. Beijing transformed you, and you were inspired by that. So we would like to hear more about that transformational experience you had, and then your political career in why we have you here among us today.
It is such an honor to be here. I'm so touched. 30 years ago, we were so young. We're full of energy. But I want to start with this. I want to start with you have to help me. Women weaving the world together. Yeah. This is one piece of 1,000 meters of this cloth from the Asia Pacific women. And I was the chair of that project, Women Weaving the World Together. It did not just happen in Beijing. It started in New York for many, many, many months, remember? And from Cambodia to New York and to Beijing, and we were like going, what is this? But we said, it's about women. It's for women and it's with women. So we were sitting together having noodles in Singapore one day, and we said, how do we weave? How do we get the Asia Pacific women's issues to Beijing? The US delegation will not listen to us. And we said, no, that's not true. This is about us. They will listen to us. So we had this. We made 1,000 meters that we wrapped around the Great Walls, part of the Great Walls of China. And that little piece was offered with such great honor to the First Lady. It was raining, I had a cold, and today I still have a cold. But to this, Women Weaving the World Together, there's one word that took me through my political life. After Beijing, 3 years later, I became a member of parliament and also the first woman to run the women's ministry. Weaving the world together means being inclusive. Beijing taught me to be inclusive. This piece of cloth, many places so that women can weave the 1,000 pieces. And we brought that 1,000 pieces to the city of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. And for those women, many of them were illiterate, had never been to the city. They were indigenous people. They wanted to talk about the mats that they wove. They brought mats, and there were termites in the mats. Oh my goodness. Anyway, it was so much sharing. And that word, this Beijing, this is Beijing, has stayed with me in my career as a politician. I thank you so much. Never forget inclusiveness, diversity, be tolerant. The women are not just in the cities. The real women are in the rural women, the indigenous women. And in the Declaration of Beijing, there's a special article on rural women. So when I was minister, I paid so much attention to these words that we learned in Beijing, the commitment that we made in Beijing. And then later on, when I became a member of parliament, 2 more terms, the fight was always for women's rights as human rights. And today I'm still in exile. I'm in exile because I refuse to be in a government that is corrupt. Cambodia is not a democracy. Cambodia is an autocracy, and it's getting worse. And that's why I'm here now, fighting to go back. Just go back. Because we have to believe that we can go back. And going back with the same principles of justice, gender justice. When I was minister, I never thought that 3 years after Beijing, I became a minister, and I was responsible for drafting the domestic violence law and get it adopted. I never thought that there would be a strong movement to change the women in Cambodia. And I'm proud, very proud, but I am worried because the world is changing too fast. Although we have Beijing behind us, but the gains that we have made may be losing. We may lose some of the gains, and that is very important for all of you who are young today. Do not take things for granted. All the freedom that you have today, for us, it was a struggle. Don't forget the struggle of the women. Thank you. I'm losing my voice, and I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Sokua, and thank you for the advice. Do not take our gains for granted, and do not accept regression or setbacks. I thought I translated what you said, but it was so powerful and inspiring, Sokua. Inclusion and diversity and unity at the same time. Thank you.
Add one more. Secretary Clinton, you changed my life forever, and I never regret even 1 second of it, and I will continue on the same path. Thank you.
Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you, Sokua. And let me now go to Alice. What was it like in Beijing? I understand it was, very early in your career, and perhaps you can share your thoughts about what difference did the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action made in your work. And we know your work and how much it has influenced your advocacy for women's rights and for equality, not only here, but the world over.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'm going to tell the story of how I ended up going to Beijing.
Okay.
So I hope that's okay.
Okay, they're going to...
And I'm going to be very fast.
We are in the minus red number.
I know, we are so deep in the red. None of these stories are short.
But I'm sure everybody wants to listen to.
There's so many women around the world who have stories exactly like this, because it was such a transformational moment, I think, for so many of us. I know there are a lot of students here, and so I want to tell you that I was a student at the time when I randomly heard, how many students do you know, well, probably a lot here at Columbia, who are thinking about what's going on at the UN or halfway around the world. But I heard about that conference, and immediately I was like, I have to go. Then I find out it's Beijing, China. Then I find out, you got to register and you got to have official NGO. So I created an NGO, not like a 501c3 NGO. I created an NGO. I registered. I was like, I am going. I thought it was 55,000 women, but maybe it was only 30, but it was a lot, 30,000 women from around the world. I wanted to learn. Think about this. Back in 1995, there was no social media. Yeah. There was no Google. If you wanted to understand global women's issues, and I wanted to understand as a young woman, what is this world I'm coming into? People were talking about the global economy, and we're all going to be connected one day, and I wanted to know, what do women face in other countries? And you couldn't get even news of this, right? So you had to go. And I just became hell-bent on going. I didn't get the right kind of paperwork back. I didn't get the right kind of visa. I went anyway. I had a very hard time actually getting into the conference. This is a story for far more wine and much more time. But I was adopted by, or taken under the wing of, a group of women from Africa who were like, we're going to help you. We're going to help you get into the conference. And I realized when I was there, these women didn't come to learn like I did. They came to fight. And I thought, looking around, learning about all the issues you learned about, learning about human trafficking. And I thought, what is that? Is that a disease, trafficking in women? What is that? And then recognizing what it actually was, modern day slavery. And I remember walking around in those final days of the conference and thinking, what can I do? Why did I feel so compelled to come? I am just a college student. What power do I have? And then the last day of the conference, got up super early to hear Secretary Clinton's speech when she came out to Wairo. And I really wanted to be there because I felt so proud that the First Lady of my country was speaking, because I felt very much like, what was my place as an American woman? And so I really wanted to be there. And that speech changed my life because it made me realize that, yes, I'm a college student, but I have a voice. like she has. And she used that voice, that speech, caught wildfire around the world, in a pre-social media era. It set forth this global women's movement. It created the organization I now run, Vital Voices, which is a network of 47,000 badass, Diane von Furstenberg's words, badass women leaders who are affecting massive change. But I think what it really made me realize is that we all have a voice and we all have power. And we have to use that little bit of power and that little bit of voice to impact change. I went back, ended up getting an internship at the White House, again, totally random. But follow those random things. To the young people in this audience, follow the passion. Follow what really gets you up in the morning and gets you excited, because you never know where it's going to lead. Take those chances, take those risks, and don't ever wait for an invitation to lead change.
Oh, wow. Wow, wow, wow. Follow your passion. And words do matter. The narrative matters. That phrase really changed the way, women think, women articulate, women develop policy, women connect to the global movement. So thank you. Thank you again for that phrase. And here we see how transformational these words were at the time. Follow your passion, especially for the young students here. We are in trouble in terms of time. We were prepared for a second round of questions. It's not going to happen. I'm very sorry, but give me 1 minute to do something. I will go around. I don't want these women to leave the stage in a way. Just let's take the reverse order, perhaps. And just let's say one phrase or one word that you would like to see as a headline in a newspaper, not real newspaper, perhaps e-newspaper. Yes, 30 years from now, where women, are at the center. So Ruchira, why don't we start with you?
I would say don't look up, look at each other. This is the time to do that.
Wow. Bravo. Alice?
The world recognizes that women lead differently. That difference is precisely what we need in our world today. Leaders who spread hope, not fear.
Wow. Thank you. Sokua?
I worry a lot because the world is most at war these days. But women will survive because they're not just women. They're courageous. They're dignified, and they deserve all the freedom and the respect, and you must never give up.
Thank you, Sukua. Milan, the last word.
Women have finally achieved equal rights in the world.
Oh, that is the headline we would like to see, isn't it? I just want to say thank you to these amazing women. This has been an incredible conversation. So much inspiration from all of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you for listening.
Please welcome Jennifer Klein and Erin Haynes.
Wow, hello. That was a very powerful start to mark such a consequential moment for women's rights. I think that this is an important reminder that when America speaks, the world listens. And so Beijing mattered. Beijing still matters. So just looking out into this crowd, I see the tapestry of people that really is the legacy of Beijing. So I'm really, really excited to be a part of this conversation and to be joined by you, Jen, somebody who helped us so much at the 19th with narrative change and the narrative change that we continue to be committed to. So yes, we heard in that first panel about the important gains for women and girls since the Beijing Conference in 1995. And I'm just wondering, at the 30-year mark, how are you thinking about the landscape now, where we've seen the most progress, where we're still seeing the gaps that remain?
Thank you, Erin, and again, thanks for everything you've done at the 19th and continue to do. I think we have seen significant gains since 1995, and I think that shows that progress is possible when governments and civil society and the private sector coordinate and cooperate and make commitments and keep them. So I'll just give a very brief, here's what's good and here's what's not so good. Where we have seen progress is, for example, the global gender gap in primary education has virtually closed. The rate of maternal mortality around the world is nearly halved. And advances have been made in legal rights through international agreements, groundbreaking UN resolutions, and constitutional and legislative change. Yet, unfortunately, major gaps do remain, so I'll talk about a few of those. And those don't only, but often fall into the category of economic and political participation, which really does continue to lag. So, for example, women's labor force participation globally has stagnated at about 36%. Since 1995, so it hasn't changed much. Has in the United States, despite a dip during COVID. It's pretty strong now in the United States, but globally it's still a lot of work to be done. That is in part due to the fact that women disproportionately take on the burden of unpaid caregiving. That's because high quality of affordable childcare and elder care is not always available, including in this country. And also because of social norms, which continue to persist, also changing a bit, but continue to persist, that women do that work more than men. And this is true even though, according to the likes of McKinsey, if we closed those gaps, if we actually had gender parity at work, it would boost global GDP by about $28 trillion. Women are also underrepresented in leadership positions, in government, in business, and in peace negotiations. So, for example, only 26 out of the 193 current UN member states are led by women. And the representation in parliaments around the world is also low, and even, again, despite the fact that we have evidence that when women are in positions of power in government, we have policies that are better on education, on social welfare, and of course, on gender equality. And finally, I'll just say that we know that women are underrepresented in peace negotiations. So in 2022, women represented only 16% of negotiators in active peace processes, according to the UN. And that's a decline from 23%, also too low, but in 2020. And again, despite studies that show that peace agreements with women signatories are more durable and better implemented. And then finally, I'll just, sorry, I feel like I'm only saying the bad things, but we'll get to the good things. But women continue to experience threats to their personal safety and security. 1 in 3, about 30% of women around the world have been subjected to either physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. That's an estimate by the World Health Organization. And one of the most recent forms of gender-based violence, online harassment and abuse, is growing. And again, is related to all the other things because it is one of the barriers to participation, political participation, and beyond. And then finally, conflict-related sexual violence is also on the rise. In 2023, UN verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence rose by about 50%. So that's the landscape. A lot of progress has been made, and yet we have a long way to go to get to Milan's headline.
Absolutely, and it is so important. That's why it's important to be here to name the gains, but also the challenges that remain, to mark those and to talk about the work that still remains to be done, because we know that there is a relationship between the progress that is being made on gender equality and a healthy democracy, right? And as this country purports to be a leader, a leader in democracy, what is the relationship between democracy and gender equality? Our progress on that. Our next panel, following this discussion, is going to discuss the 21st century challenges to gender equality. One major challenge I want to ask you about is about just what I'm naming here, the connection between the backsliding of democracy and the rolling back of women's rights in the United States and around the world. What can you say about this connection and why it matters?
Yeah, I think that we are seeing, sadly, a systematic attack on women's rights and gender equity, as you said, right here in the United States and around the world, and that is integrally connected to democracy. We've seen everything from, ongoing relentless edicts by the Taliban in Afghanistan to the reversal of Roe versus Wade, which you and I have talked about for 2+ years now in the United States. And at the heart of this backlash, both domestic and global, are really deeply embedded and often harmful gender norms. We saw that in the last election and the consequences that it had. I think many of us hoped and thought that what we were seeing was a very gendered election in a very different way than what we did see. So, when Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Dobbs decision, women around this country were mad and they were motivated. And what we thought we would see, and that was, by the way, across party lines, across geography, across demography, and what we thought we would see in this election was a vote for candidates that promised to protect access to abortion, to protect reproductive freedom, most of all, obviously, the vice president running for president. And we did see support for abortion in this election. I think there's too much has been said, it didn't really turn out to be a motivating issue. I think it very much did. And we see that in the ballot initiatives that passed across the country with overwhelming support. But I think we also saw another part of a very gendered election, which was the rise of the quote-unquote manosphere, and the quote-unquote masculine energy I read about. And, this was also a very motivating force in this election for both Republican men and, interestingly, for Republican women. So, I think what we saw was permission for people, men in particular maybe, who were feeling angry, who were feeling that they were losing power. And while women were gaining it, what we see again in this country is women are more educated, they have more professional responsibilities than ever before. And somehow that loss of power and that sort of deeply embedded norm that they were losing power became very prevalent. And I'll just add that this is not unique to the United States. In fact, this connection between authoritarianism and gender inequality, between democracy and gender equality, is really being eroded around the world, and we see the impact that has. So I will just give a couple of examples there. It's really a global trend. There was a UN report that came out fairly recently that said that 1 in 4 countries reported backlash in women's rights in 2024. So a few examples. In Argentina, the president vowed to remove the concept of femicide from the penal code. In Poland, there's a relatively new, very restrictive abortion law. And in Turkey, President Erdogan removed the country from the Istanbul Convention, which of course is a very important convention on gender-based violence, and the irony of it being the Istanbul Convention, which was where it was signed and negotiated. Turkey removing themselves from that is just, the sort of final irony.
Yeah, having this conversation in a global context absolutely matters, because the extent to which women feel free and equal, and that their voices, that they have agency in a democracy, that they are able to be civically engaged, that absolutely matters. So as you think about the work ahead to implement the Beijing agenda over the next 30 years, are you optimistic? I mean, I just listened to this panel hearing about just the courage and imagination that was sparked by this moment. It feels like we need a Beijing moment right now to keep the progress moving forward.
Well, I think I am optimistic, and that might seem odd given where we are. But I'm optimistic for a couple of reasons. The first is we're about to hear from an unbelievable group of women leaders. There are many unbelievable women leaders, young women in this audience on the live stream. And the thing that gives me optimism is this next generation of leaders who are, I think somebody used the word impatient at the very beginning, who are impatient. And quite frankly, to use the technical term, they're done with us. They're ready to take the mantle, take the baton and go. And that is the most important thing as I look at a group of many students, the most important thing that makes me optimistic. I will also say, and this is not exactly your question, but I can't help but leave with a to-do list. Because the other thing that gives me optimism is we know what to do. We need to make sure that people have the ability to participate. Yes. They need to vote. They need to help other people organize to vote. And figure out other ways to lead. If you live in a place where voting is not an option, or if you want to run for office or help somebody run for office, these are really important things for people to do. We need to organize and learn lessons from international women's movements. For example, the Green Wave reproductive rights movement in Latin America, or climate activists, or democracy activists around the world. There are amazing young women doing amazing work. We, of course, need to continue. We talked about the importance of the laws that have been passed. We need to continue to pass and implement laws right here in the United States. We need to focus on the state level to do that. Because we're facing a time of, obviously, a federal inaction or worse. And then beyond rights on paper, we need to address the underlying norms that I talked about briefly before, and this notion of discomfort with women's power. Because without the power to exercise the rights on paper, we will never, as Secretary Clinton has said, the most famous thing she said is women's rights are human rights. She's also said something that resonates with me every day, which is that this is the unfinished business of the 21st century. And if we don't take on that final piece, which is addressing the underlying norms, so that people can claim their power, we will never actually finish that business. And finally, I think, and this is sometimes an unpopular thing to say, but I will say it anyway, I think we need to engage with people who have different perspectives. That means, whether that's in person, thank you. Whether that's in person, whether that's on social media, the other side does a really effective job of reaching people with social media and other tech tools, and we are not doing as good a job talking to, listening to, hearing from, and deeply engaging with people, because we're not going to get the power that we need if we are not bringing others along with us.
Jen, I could not agree with you more. Gender equality is not a zero-sum game, and I would add that this is also about the unfinished business of the 19th Amendment, which our newsroom is named for, and obviously you do not have to be told that this was not just about the vote. It was about unlocking women's equal participation in this democracy, to have access to healthcare, to education, to the economy, to be free from violence, to be free from discrimination, to have political participation. All of those things are unlocked when we unlock our ability to participate fully as citizens in a democracy. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Renata Koch Alvarenga, Aya Shebi, Pumzile Van Dam, Nika Kovac, and moderator Rachel Vogelstein.
Thanks, everyone. This afternoon, we have heard testimonials from leaders who were in Beijing about the historic breakthroughs that were achieved in 1995, and then we just heard a little bit about some of the progress that's been made and the challenges that remained. We are very privileged now to hear from young leaders who are really at the forefront of the global women's movement about forging the path ahead. Nika, I'm going to start with you. Democracy. It's under attack here in the US and around the world. In country after country, we have seen the rise of authoritarianism and that it's correlated with regression on women's rights. Can you talk to us about how you and your organization have promoted women's rights in your pro-democracy efforts?
Yeah, hi to all of you. So basically for me, feminism is always fight against all sorts of inequalities, whether it comes to environment, workers' rights, or protecting peace. And the second thing about feminism it is that it is also offering a vision for tomorrow. On the other hand, we have authoritarians who are attacking our rights, and in one moment they always attack something which is super important for the people. And I think that the responsibility of the feminist movements and movements in general is to notice that moment and to resist them. In my country, we had an authoritarian leader. When he took over the government, he basically took over the police, the media, he attacked the independent institutions, and he also wanted to privatize water. And my organization, which is an organization full of women in their 30s, decided to fight him, not with protest, but with calling a referendum. And unite people around a common value, invite them to join us, even though they voted for him. We said, we are uniting about water, and we will fight him based on our common value. We did this big movement with not just young women, but mostly with retired women, who are the real badasses of our fight of resistance. And we managed to brought half of the country to the referendum and won by 87%. We became the biggest movement of resistance in Slovenia. They all wanted us to become a party. I said, this is too boring for me. I don't want to go into politics, but we will lead a get out and vote movement. We organized people, again, with retired women, with men, and we made sure that we raised political participation for 20% and we changed the government. What are the main lessons? The first lesson is unite people around social state, around common values, around life full of dignity. Second, don't be close in your bubble. Talk with the people, talk with rural communities. Don't be angry if they are not using the right words. Think about what is uniting you. The third thing, speak about the men who are destroying our life, call them by the name, and talk to them directly. And fourth, if you're a woman, they will attack you. The ex-prime minister had more than 40% tweets just about me. I was physically attacked on the street. I still cannot walk alone on the streets of my home country. But you know why? What? Every single time that he did it, we were more kind, more loud, and we fought back. And this is what we are still doing. And I think this is one of the pathways to protect the democracy with feminist values and with a common vision of tomorrow, which is not just surrounded around gender. Gender is like one big part of it, but around broader issues. And you always need to know that even if we are a group of girls in their 20s, 30s, wearing pink color and listening to pop music and Taylor Swift, you can win a fight.
Well, if that isn't a roadmap for action and progress, I don't know what is. But I want to pick up on one of the issues, Ika, that you raised, and Pumzile, turn to you. We know that one of the biggest threats to women's political and civic participation today is the rise in online harassment and abuse, and that these online attacks are disproportionately focused on women leaders, and that we're in a moment where trust and safety protections are being rolled back online. So, Pumzile,
As a former member of parliament in South Africa, you've played a really pivotal role in holding social media platforms accountable. What changes do you think are needed in order to combat online harassment and abuse and to promote women's full and equal participation in public life?
Yeah, so I always like to think of my leadership as a relatively young person. I'm 41 now. I always like to think of it as generational. So I see the women who came before me, Secretary Clinton, Elise, and Vital Voices, and the amazing work they do supporting leaders. I like to think they made it easier for me. It meant that I could get elected as a young MP. I was 31 when I was elected. And the fight that my generation had to take on was social media, because at that time, social media was an essential tool to be elected. It was an essential tool to connect with your constituents, to get your message out, and it became increasingly more difficult to exist as a woman online. There's a cyber stalking, there's the gender disinformation. I think over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a rise, the access to generative AI has seen a rise in deepfake pornography depicting women leaders. So there was so much progress that we had done, like the progress from the women who were at Beijing 30. It was finally getting laws in place against online violence against women. Governments were finally working together. There was a global partnership against online violence against women, which the State Department was leading. There was far more activism against social media platforms. I mean, Facebook used to be afraid of the public. They used to be afraid of civil society. And that has changed. So I always tell women leaders, younger women leaders, that I don't want it to be difficult for them on social media. I don't want to tell them it's hard and, don't be in these spaces. I don't want that to be the message that I give them. But unfortunately, given what's happened around the world, we have to fight. We need all generations of women at the front lines saying to Mark Zuckerberg, what do you mean that workplaces have been neutered and masculine energy needs to be injected? There need to be protests outside Facebook headquarters. That's what has been done for years. That's how we got to that stage of progress. And now I feel like that progress has sort of regressed. And as women, that's why I'm so happy to be here and in this room with so many women doing amazing things. We need to take it directly to the owners of social media platforms and say, no, it's not okay. You can't say that. We need to say to the owner of Twitter, which I still can't call X, that it's not okay that you re-platform people like Andrew Tate. So it's important for us as women to start speaking up against the owners. We need to push legislators to do more work around platform accountability. I think the EU is kind of the global leader in that work, and I think all countries can learn from that, because platforms know that they can't go into the EU, for example, and not obey those laws, and they can do it in so many other countries. So my message is, unfortunately, we need to fight again, and that fight requires women of all generations, because social media is such a pivotal part of the work that we do as leaders, work that we do to make sure that we have gender equality. So I'd really just encourage that we need to hike up our activism. We need to make social media a space where women can exist and not have to fear being subjected to online pornography, to generative AI pornography, to be subjected to cyber stalking. The fight is on.
It is indeed. It is indeed, and it's a great reminder that this is work we have to do in partnership. And there's a global coalition now working on these issues, the Global Partnership on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse. Hopefully it will continue to grow, and it will take all of our efforts together to tackle this problem. I want to pick up on a note that, Pumzile, you just mentioned about intergenerational cooperation. And Aya, turn to you. You have been a leading voice for democracy in the Tunisian Revolution. You've pioneered a model of intergenerational cooperation in your work, and you've established Africa's largest platform committed to women's leadership. And importantly, you've helped bring youth voices into the halls of power. Tell us why it's so important to have young women at the table to address 21st century challenges, and how we can enlist the full participation of young people in this current fight for gender equality.
Why? Because young women don't take bullshit from self-serving politicians, right? Who act like they are above the law, who behave like unconstitutional. I think we are a generation that is unapologetic about asking for productive freedom, financial freedom, political freedom, because it's not a favor, it's our rights. And we are built like this, fearless and warriors and fighters, because of all the women who were in Beijing in 1995. Because all the feminists, all the movements who fought for these rights, it wasn't handed over to them. So no, we're not gonna chill, we're gonna push back the pushback. Right? So I heard someone from the previous panel worried about, I don't want you to worry about the future, it's in good hands. So if you look at youth activism for the past 15 years, where it started in my country, Tunisia, I lived under dictatorship for 23 years. I was 23 at the time. I was part of the youth movement that ended the dictatorship, started the democratic process. And since then until today, it has been a relentless generation that is saying change is required. From Egypt to Zimbabwe, from Senegal to Algeria, over 500 protests took place in Africa. Over 10 dictatorships ended by youth movement. These movements had a youth face, had a women face. And it was not a protest to place people in power. It was a protest to transform the system. Because even, last year, Gen Z protest in Kenya, I don't know if you've been following, it was protesting an IMF-backed financial bill and taxation increase. So people look at young people, even the climate movement, oh, young people are, making noise and fighting for youth rights. No, young people are fighting for dignity. They're fighting for livelihoods. They're fighting for freedom that concern all of us. And I think young people have 3 superpowers. So the first power is a demographic power. We are the youngest population in history. Half of the world is young. But even so, Africa has 70% under 30. So we're the youngest population in the world, except Europe, it's Asian, which is why Europe needs young Africans, right, to migrate. So migration makes sense. And then we have the voting power. I always tell young people, if we start a political party in Africa, we will all win in our countries. We're the majority. And we have the digital power, because we turned social media into a tool for social change. Before that, it was for graduation and wedding parties. But in Tunisia, we started the first Facebook event to come to a protest, right? But what we are facing right now is a crisis of leadership, a global crisis of leadership. And 2, for Africa particularly, a generation gap. Because 65 is the average age of African leaders, and 20 is the average age of the population. And for me, the only way forward is intergenerational co-leadership. When I moved from street protest, dealing with tear gas and police brutality, to the African Union, dealing with 55 male egos, I don't know which one is worse, but guess who supported me in that process? It was the elder women. It was President Sirleaf, it was DSG Amina Mohammed, it was Dr. Ngozi, it was Dr. Pomzile, and many, many, many women in the system who made intergenerational co-leadership possible, and we could move the needles together. So I took that model and I talked to African leaders every single day, and I wanted mindset change to get as young people as possible in the system, because I told them, you can't hand over to us a 60 years colonial and patriarchal system and expect us to succeed. You can't pass the torch. We have to co-lead now for a peaceful transfer of power. And we published a report with case studies of youth in governance, and they listened. Evidence, they implemented the policies, and before the end of my mandate as youth envoy, we managed to increase youth in ministerial portfolios and parliamentary seats, and especially young women, the highest since the 80s. And why I say the 80s? Because the same leaders who were in the 80s elected still the leaders today. But it is possible. And of course, I got my own share of patriarchy every day and of mansplaining and misogyny, but we got the work done. But I think what's important is if you want to invest in democracy in Africa, invest in young women political leaders. Because the leadership we are trying to build is intergenerational, is feminist, is brave, and that's what the world needs right now.
I think if any of the young people here have doubts about their power, hopefully Aya's comments have put those doubts to rest. And Renat, I want to turn to you because you are also leading an initiative with Youth at the Forefront, which is focused on raising awareness of the effect of climate change in the global South. And in your work, you've highlighted the important role of women in efforts to combat climate change. So tell us more about why women's leadership and participation are so critical to climate efforts.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Honestly, sitting in front of my role models here, including the young people and all of you next to me, such a pleasure. Because that's why I started to do the work I do. I mean, I started in the climate space, but I always understood myself as a feminist, as someone that fought for women's rights. I grew up with a very strong, powerful mother, sister, grandmother, which hopefully many of you can relate. But when it comes to the climate crisis, a lot of the rhetoric that we hear in the narrative is negative towards women. It's women as victims, women related to poverty, to gender-based violence, to inequality, to lack of resources, especially in the global South, in a country like Brazil, in Latin America, all over Africa. But what I started to notice is that if we want to change who are the people that we see making decisions at the COPs, at the CSW, at these high-level decision-making spaces, we have to start shifting the narrative as well. So yes, we can talk about the negative sides of climate change. I mean, 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. Women and children are 14 times more likely to die from climate disasters than men. So the data is there. It is unequal. There is a huge disparity when it comes to women and men in the climate crisis. But we need to go further because there's also resilience. I mean, how many people here know a resilient woman? There's so many. And that's the same thing when it comes to climate change. My home state, my hometown, just faced its worst climate disaster last year in Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil. The worst flooding we had ever faced, 96% of the state affected. And this is what we saw. Shelters that were built for people to evacuate, for people to be safe after having to leave their flooded homes, were unsafe spaces for women. I mean, women and children had to leave and go to shelters that were specific for women because they were not safe in these general shelters. And so you see the disparity there, but who built these shelters? A lot of women's collectives, young feminist groups. And so the same people that are the most vulnerable, that are facing the worst effects of many global challenges, including climate change, are the ones making that change, are the ones that are building those policies that are gender just, that are changing those narratives. And I relate a lot to the Beijing conversations and the 1995 being there because I was 18 when I attended my first COP, the UN Climate Conference, which was COP21. That generated the Paris Agreement. So similar to the Beijing platform, the Paris Agreement is the most monumental agreement we have to solve the climate crisis. So I was there as a 17, 18-year-old in the space as a young woman, not seeing myself or my peers represented in that space. And so now we're celebrating 10 years of the Paris Agreement. The situation hasn't changed. So what I hope as we think about climate change and gender inequality is that we bring more young women to the forefront, to these conversations, to these stages. I'm here, but I bring so many people along with me. So it's such a pleasure to be here. And hopefully we can not only bring women to these spaces, but bring gender-just policies. Have allies in governments, at the UN, at the local level, in private sector, that are not only doing this work, but also bringing the allyship and the gender equality with them.
I think that's really inspiration for all of us to take the spirit of what was forged in Beijing and to bring it to all of the places where decisions are being made that affect all of our lives. That's great. That's a great to-do list for all of us. I'm going to close with a question for all of you. Every single one of you is really at the forefront of addressing 21st century obstacle to gender equality, whether it's online harassment and abuse or climate change or threats to democracy around the world. And we have a lot of young leaders and students who are with us today and participating online. What is your advice for them in terms of what they can do to help strengthen women's rights in this moment and to realize the promise of the Beijing Platform for Action? Nika, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I will be very honest. Like, for me, there is nothing more beautiful than protest movements. Like, people sacrificing their comfort, their career to stand up for something that they believe in. And honestly, I don't feel that I'm competent enough to give advice to Columbia students because they were such a source of inspiration for me in the past couple of months with how they bravely stand for things that they believe in. But I think that there is something that we all can do. We all have some sort of a power now, and I think that we need to remind ourselves again and again that being critical voice, that speaking truth to the power is so often so uncomfortable, that is so often so hard. We saw what is happening when people are in the land of freedom of speech, arrested because of the stuff that they were saying. And I strongly believe that our responsibility and advice to all of us is that we stand with them. And that this is something that we can do. And when we stand with the people who are speaking up, even though sometimes we don't totally agree, even though we fully agree, is that we are standing with resistance and with the society which is allowing resistance. And this is democracy.
Pumzile, I'm going to turn to you next. What is your advice for young people?
I want to encourage young people to get actively involved in politics and not see politicians as those people and trusting politicians and thinking it's them and us. I'd like to encourage young people to join political parties, to run for public office. We need to be the change we want to see. I know, there's less women running for public office now because of the harassment that they see online. I want to tell young people, I want to tell young women, fight. You need to fight. What is happening right now, it does have me worried. It has me worried if women aren't running for public office. Not as many women are running for public office. Young people have become disenchanted with politics and they're not taking part. We need young people taking part. We need them running for public office. We need them involved.
Aya, words of wisdom for the rising generation.
Pumzile, do not worry. We do exactly that. We have 10,000 women preparing for elections. But I 100% agree. Before I answer the question, if I may, I would really like to invite everybody to be in solidarity with Sudanese women and girls who are facing the largest and worst humanitarian crises. We have Sudanese in the room, we have South Sudanese in the room. And if you can do one thing today, one action, go to change.org and sign a petition, immediate ceasefire in Sudan. We're launching this campaign on Friday at NYU. To answer your question, two things we learned from the revolution. We told ourselves first, we cannot be a generation of waithood. We cannot wait for things to be fixed. We cannot wait for change. It's our future at stake, and we have to do something about it. And two, we have to be political. Your hair is political. My head wrap is political. It's my grandma's signature. The university you choose is political. Today, food security have become political. Conflict-related gender-based violence is political. Water, as we used as a tool of war, has become political. So your voice matters because gender equality is political. And for young men particularly, feminism is not a threat to you. It's not a threat. The biggest threat today is climate change, which is caused by unethical leadership. So focus on that, not on women's bodies. I think we all have a role to play, and this is your fight too. There is an African proverb that says, Where you are when you're old shows where you stood when you were young. So where will you stand?
Renata, some closing words for our audience.
Wow. When I was thinking of what to say, I thought this all sounds kind of cliche, but really the reality is the women's rights advice that we often give sounds cliche because we've been doing this for many, many years and saying, let's go, let's do this, but we need more, right? And we've advanced so much, but what I would say, especially to young feminists, young students who I work with every day in my NGO in Brazil, is you can be part of that change. I know it's cliche, but listen, when the world is so overwhelming, we're hearing development aid being cut, friends being fired, money not going where they're supposed to go, people just losing everything they have due to the climate crisis. These things are a lot, I get that. Anxiety is a big thing right now among young people just because how are we supposed to take on all that burden? But I'm here to tell you that even one little thing that you can do helps because we're shifting that narrative forward. We're shifting the power towards young people to make that change. If the systems change is not possible right now because our decision makers are not doing what they're supposed to do, let us do that change. Let us make the changes in the system that we need and hopefully get more young girls, young women into those spaces, especially young women from the Global South, into these global stages where they're not right now. Yeah.
All right, well, to summarize, our marching orders are to speak out, to run for office, don't wait, and be the change you want to see. Please help me thank our wonderful panelists.
Please welcome Paula Johnson.
Well, welcome, and what an inspirational afternoon. I think we're all kind of talking like, we need this. Welcome, everyone, and I'm Paula Johnson. I am at Wellesley College. We are currently celebrating our 150th year of educating brilliant women to be transformative forces in the world. And when we talk about hope, I think, Dean Milo, thank you for your leadership. And I think we're both in the education business, which means that we are in the young people's business, which means that that is the business of hope. There is no other choice. So I am so proud today to introduce this panel of transformative women who are really going to consider where we are 30 years out from the landmark United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, the global backlash and fulfilling the promise. So I am going to say it again because you can't say it enough times. As you know, that conference yielded the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, adopted unanimously by 189 countries, which set objectives for the advancement of women and gender equality. It included an unforgettable speech that we have heard about over and over, and now we get her in person, by then, at that point, the First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton. And I do want to just remember that Madeleine Albright, at that time the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, left her daughter's wedding reception to be there with the First Lady. And of course, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights once and for all. That is, of course, an eternal truth. The only part that can be quibbled with right now is the phrase once and for all. Since we know we are in a period of devastating backsliding around the world, whether it be from China to Afghanistan to Sudan to the US, where in our own country, in the wake of the Dobbs decision striking down the right to abortion, we have physicians unsure, and I am a physician, and it's horrifying to think unsure about whether they can legally terminate a pregnancy even when a woman's life is threatened by it. And we're already seeing the devastating outcomes of these restrictive laws with the deaths of pregnant women and higher than expected infant mortality rates in states that have these bans. We also have a vice president of the United States who blames institutions like Wellesley and Columbia for telling women that they can find satisfaction in their careers as well as in their families. And it's, of course, no coincidence that the erosion of women's rights coincides with the erosion of democratic values. The Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, currently led by Ambassador Verveer, has shown that women's status and the health of a democracy are strongly correlated. Around the world, however, nostalgia for traditional gender roles is a lever being used by autocrats to seize power. The question is, how do we resist? And we heard a lot about how we resist today. How do we insist that women and girls everywhere have the right to determine their own destinies and to shape their lives as they see fit, without fear and without discrimination? We know that empowering women is one of the best ways to improve society at large. How do we ensure that such empowerment continues to happen? I'm just going to repeat some of the words that we heard from our panels. From Beijing: solidarity, movement, listen to each other, inclusivity, diversity, and unity. The fight is always for women's rights. Don't ever wait for an invitation to change the world. And women weaving the world together. So fortunately, we have some of the most distinguished women leaders in the world here to consider these questions. So please allow me to introduce them. We have with us Michelle Bachelet, the first woman president of Chile, who served from 2006 to 2010, and then again from 2014 to 2018. President Bachelet is an Institute of Global Politics inaugural Carnegie Distinguished Fellow and a member of GWL Voices, an organization of 75 women leaders from around the world committed to building a gender-equal international system. Also with us is Hillary Rodham Clinton. Sorry, I didn't know that there was a specific order. Sorry. Thank you, Paul. Okay. Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, the 67th United States Secretary of State, former United States Senator from New York, namesake of Wellesley's Hillary Rodham Clinton Center for Citizenship, Leadership, and Democracy, and a member of the Wellesley College class of 1969. And it's an honor to introduce Susana Malcorra, former Foreign Minister of Argentina, co-founder of GWL Voices, and another Institute of Global Politics Carnegie Distinguished Fellow. And as moderator, we have Christiane Oh, here is President Sirleaf. Okay. And we have with us Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who served as president of Liberia from 2006 to 2018. Africa's first elected woman head of state. President Sirleaf is a 2011 Nobel Prize laureate. And as moderator, we have Christiane Amanpour, the chief international correspondent of CNN and an Institute of Global Politics Carnegie Distinguished Fellow, who brings us the truth every night. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. What an illustrious group of women here, and all the women we've heard from this afternoon have been truly inspiring throughout the generations, going back to Beijing, listening to the young warriors speak so powerfully. And now, well, I'm not going to say the elder stateswomen. No, I'm not. But let me start with you, Secretary Clinton. Your comment went viral before there was such a thing as viral, and it's still going viral. Everybody knows what you said in Beijing 30 years ago. And I just wonder, A, how that feels, and B, when you see what's happening in your own country, where historically America has given so much money and help and empowerment to women around the world, and now USAID being cut and those programs being cut, your feelings about it, and how can that hole be filled for women around the world 30 years after Beijing?
Well, Christiane, thank you. And thanks to this panel and the prior panels and everyone who organized this. It could not come at a better time for us to take stock and understand where we have come from, where we are today, and what we need to do together if we expect to, as one of our panelists said, push back the pushback. 30 years ago, when we met in Beijing and adopted by consensus the Platform for Action, it was a breathtaking moment of such potential. And then over the succeeding years, I, along with many others, traveled around the world looking at the progress that was being made, the laws that were being passed, the laws that were being changed that, for example, prohibited inheritance of wives of their husband's property. You cannot imagine, unless you look at that platform and really study where we were 30 years ago, how few rights women had in most places in the world. So it was a time of great excitement and hope. And then, of course, we had leaders like President Bachelet, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and others who were putting into practice the spirit and the letter of the platform. They were leading political parties and political change because they were in the position to do so. So I have to say that, you know, for me, it was a very positive and continuing promise of what we could realize together. And it has been disheartening and disappointing to see the pushback get political power. It started in other places in the world, but certainly it has come home to roost in the United States. And I think you heard, particularly from the panel of young leaders, some of the reasons why. You know, people in power forever, social media being a partner with political oppressors, and so much more. So we're back in the fight. You know, we have no choice. It isn't like we can say, okay, fine, we saved a little bit of the progress, because given their head, a lot of these leaders will push back as far as they can and deprive women, minorities, marginalized communities, political opponents of every single right and pathway to power that they can block. So this is a moment to take stock, but also to get re-energized.
And you're energized. And I didn't even say in the introduction that the official policy of this country is now to roll back DEI. So, I mean, it's the official policy. Women and other minorities are being scrubbed from just about every public institution, government institution.
Unless they pledge allegiance to the leadership.
Yeah. But still, AI bots are doing it, and you can't believe who's being scrubbed from the archive and from memory. So a pushback to the pushback, President Bachelet. You were the first directly elected president, female president of Chile, first in Latin America. You've seen, not in your own country where the riots continue, but in places like Argentina or Brazil, some of the very reactionary leaders have been pushing anti-rights policies. As well, we have the first female president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, who's standing up and being very brave right now, by the way. What is a strategy, rather than words, what is a strategy for this pushback?
Well, first of all, I have to say that it's true, as you say, Christiane, that in Latin America we have advances and pushbacks. But on the other hand, I want to say that one of the ways to respond to this is like what the young people said before, is mobilizing, participating. Because in Argentina, for example, when Milei cut all the budget for access to abortion or reproductive rights, people were in the streets protesting. Or when he said that the human rights defenders were a cancer that has to be eradicated, people went to the streets to protest. And we know what we need to do in terms of, in general, that we need to, but I think the first thing is we need to stick together. Because there's so many women's organizations, so many groups working there, but isolated, not coordinated, not talking between them among themselves. So what I think we need to do, because, I mean, we know what we have to do, but that's in another context. And we need to do that anyway, but we need to think differently now. Because I think we're in a big danger of losing many hard-gained wants, but we need to then sit together, define objectives and priorities, and define the strategies in this current and particular context. Because, of course, we need more women in political participation, we need more, I would say, financial support for women's organizations. When you read that all organizations of women activists in the world receive the same money as one F-16, you cannot believe it. I mean, that's unbelievable. I mean, that's so little. So we need more financing for all the women's rights activists and women's, not only rights activists, but bottom grass women who organize their communities, who work for rights for boys and the children and the communities. But of course, we also need, global solidarity, global voice to be heard. Because people, when they are at the local level, they're doing the bigger efforts, not to go backwards, but they need support. They need to know they're not alone. And also, of course, we need voting, but I have to say, in many countries of the world, the far right is winning the election. So voting is not only the solution. We need to understand exactly what's going on. We need to find out if the narrative we used in the past is still the narrative we need to use now. So we need to do this, the good things we have done, the good lessons we have learned, but I think we need to think more deep in what is the new context, what we should be the next steps.
I'm going to move on, but I need you to just explain this voting and the far right. The far right is, many of them are led by women, but the far right are anti-women. I mean, their views are very much, their so-called pro-family rights and this and that. Is that also contributing to this reversal of women's rights?
Yes, in a sense, I would say yes. And there is some studies done in Latin America on 3 cases, Bolsonaro, Milei, and Cast in Chile. So Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. And one of the things that unites them is the women's rights movement, the anti-sexual reproductive rights, etc. And what happens is that the kind of discourse and language they send through social media mainly, TikTok, they use a lot TikTok, like in the AfD in Germany, is saying the message, a very simple message, something not very, because people are not reading too much, they're not going too deep, they're this urgency kind of generation. They're saying to them, you know what, women has been winning places that they were yours before. So now, and you see in Spain, in Latin America, the number of young men who are feeling that feminists, they're anti-feminists because they feel they are losing. So we need to work on that.
And that's happening in this country as well. Somebody mentioned the manosphere. We've had this administration facilitate the return of two of the most toxic, the two Tate brothers, who were wanted for all sorts of women trafficking, pornography, abuse, and this and that, brought back into this country. I want to turn to President Sirleaf in Liberia. Thank you for being with us on the video monitor there. You also made history on your continent by being the first ever female elected head of state in Africa. If everybody remembers Pray the Devil Back to Hell, there was a certain women's power movement that got rid of the dictator Charles Taylor and set the stage for you to be able to succeed at that time. And yet, all these years after Beijing, in the world, only 26 out of 193 UN member states have women as their head of state. Just a quarter of women are represented in parliaments around the world. I don't know whether you focus a lot on this, but certainly in this room, some of the consensus has been online harassment, the outside pressure on women, the abuse of women who run for office is a real problem and stands in the way of women doing what you did. Do you feel that, and how do you think you can get more women in power in Africa?
Thank you. Well, let me say that we are all disappointed that 30 years after the Beijing Conference, women are still so far behind in leadership throughout the world. One of the things we simply have to do is to move from words to action. The Commission for the Status of Women are meeting right now in New York. They've been meeting for the past decade, saying the same things, doing the same things, but those words have not turned into action. At the same time, I reject the statement that I think we have Are we on?
Yes, carry on. You've got a couple more minutes to make your speech. Just a couple minutes.
Anyway, I reject the statement that it would take 130 years for us to achieve gender equity. So what do? I think we need to support action for the education and knowledge of girls, because those are the enablers that will get them to go past their fears. I think we also need to invest in women businesses. That's going to be able to do something about the financing for women. A major stumbling block for those women that want to do competitive advancement through elections. We also need to popularize, to actually go into the public space, monitor, advocate those particular measures, those enabling policies and laws that have enabled women to achieve a higher position of leadership. I mean, how does a place like Rwanda have over 60% women in parliament? Far greater than women than any place in the world, any nation in the world. We need to also join those movements, those institutions and organizations that are doing everything they can to be able to monitor the progress of women, to make sure that the information on the status of women are made known, that we can generate sensitivity with men so that the progress of women can be, we can make it a competitive thing when it comes to those measures, laws, policies that have advanced women, that have protected women, and make sure that those nations that have done it, that we applaud them and we set them as an example for others to follow. because that's the only way we will change the minds and the attitudes of men, which is important for us to achieve what we want. We need also to know that there's no monopolization of knowledge or measures that we take. Women have to be able to reach out to other women. We need to find a circle of vested interests, a circle of those who have been able to go past all of the roadblocks for the achievement of women in leadership, and make sure that we use them as monitors to promote the institutions that are doing what they can for the protection of women, the promotion of women to higher positions of leadership, and have this circle find a way to monitor each other, to exchange views, to build a platform where they can talk to each other and they can work together to be able to achieve it.
Okay.
We have so many institutions that are doing this, but they're all working in silos.
Okay, Madam President.
And until we can bring them together, they attain purpose. Yes, I am.
No, it's great. I'm going to put
shut
that,
me
though.
up.
No, I'm not shutting you up. I'm going to come back. I would never dare. Are you kidding? Mrs. Malcora, you were the foreign minister.
You know, I'm determined. You shut me up, I'll come right back.
Oh, yeah, you
I'll
should.
wait until you're ready.
You should. I'm picking up your thread in the room here. So, one of the things that President Sirleaf said, and here we are in the home of the United Nations. You did run, didn't you, to be the first female Secretary General of the United Nations in 2016, and you are going to present yourself again. It's never happened, right? You are going to do it again.
I'm not.
Oh, you're not. Okay, but still, it's never happened. So, to the President's point that there's endless talking circles and nothing gets done, or not enough gets done, what can you say about an institution as powerful as the UN to try to actually move things along in the way that we've been discussing?
Thank you, Christiane, and thanks, Karen, for bringing us together. I will say one thing. We need a Madam Secretary General.
Correct. And a Madam President.
That's what we need. And let me tell you, it's not because it's a time for women, it's not because it's the right thing to do, it's not because it's just, it's because we need something different. In this day and age, when things are challenged in areas that we never thought will be challenged, we need a leadership that approaches things in a different way. And what will be more different in the case of the United Nations than to have for the first time a woman Secretary General that represents half of the peoples of the world. So that's what we need. And we needed to make it work. We needed to make it change. We needed to make it really effective. It's not that a Secretary General on her own will make the magic. We are not Wonder Woman, and that's something that we need to be very careful with, that all of a sudden we will be able to solve magically everything. But the way women listen, and this was said in other panels, the way women understand the other's perspective, the way women are ready to build bridges, the way women are focused on impact and results, the way women really are caretakers of the institutions they lead, the way women look after resources, because we do it at home and we do it in corporations. We do it at the local level, we should do it at the global level. All of that, you should yield an environment that is conducive to a productive change. We cannot get rid of the construct that has been put together for so many years by so many. But we need to renew it, we need to retool it. And we can only do that if we have a different approach. Let's give it a try. Let's give the opportunity to that half of population that never had the opportunity. And let's be truthful to the Charter of the United Nations that says, we the peoples. It doesn't say, we the man. And it does say, and this is very important, men and women have equal rights. And this was written in 1945, when Latin America played a significant role in writing those words, with Latin American women present. And we hope that we will get to the position where there will be a woman soon, next year. I will not run for that. Being there, done it. I will make sure that the deep bench that we have is well represented.
Excellent, excellent. So we have about 7 minutes left on our panel, so I'm doing a final lightning round with everybody. Hillary Clinton, I could ask you a million questions, but I wonder if people want to know how you came to that quote. How did you write it? How did you find it? Did you think it would have such a dramatic impact for so long? And a related question, as Mrs. Malcora said, it's not charity to have equal rights. It's also, in a capitalist country, very good for the bottom line, GDP and all the rest of it. So how did you come with those words? And what will happen to the United States if women are, DEI'd out?
Well, very, very briefly, I had traveled prior to going to Beijing to South Asia and had visited a number of countries, met with a lot of leaders, but also grassroots organizations. And when I was in New Delhi, a young woman, a high school student, wrote a poem about the silence of women. And her principal was invited to an event where I was going to be. And so the principal of her school brought me this poem. And it was about how women speak the same language, the language of silence, where women silence themselves, where they don't say what they think, where they're afraid of conflict, where they don't stand up for themselves. And I was so struck by it that I invited the young woman to meet with me, which I did the following day. And she talked about her grandmother and about her mother and how she was getting an education, and she was getting an education in large measure so she could use her voice. And so I started thinking about that. And when I said I wanted to go to the Women's Conference, and as we already heard from Milan, that was not a popular view. There were people in our government, a government my husband headed, who did not want me to go. There were a lot of people in the Congress who had all different kinds of reasons why the United States should go, and certainly I should not go. So basically I said, well, I won't go then in an official capacity. I'll just buy an airline ticket and I'll go. And that kind of caused everybody to focus a little bit more on what we might do. And so then I began working. What is it I want to say? And it was so striking to me as I was talking to, a lot of people from around the world about what this conference was going to be focused on, that people kept saying, well, women can't do this, or women are not legally allowed to do that, or women are not permitted. And, that language was just so offensive. And so we worked. I had a wonderful speechwriter named Lissa Muscatine. My dear, dear friend, Secretary Madeleine Albright, was somebody who supported me in going and was heading our delegation. So after that event, Christiane, I went on Voice of America. And we did a global call-in. And I'll never forget, I got a call from a man in Iran. And the man in Iran said, I heard about your speech. What do you mean women's rights are human rights? What does that mean? And I said, I want you to shut your eyes, and I want you to think about every right you as a man have. We don't want more, and we don't want less. We want the same rights, and that's what it means. And so this has been a way of demanding what we are due, but not demanding more than. And you talk about the pushback, and particularly young men, and they are being aided and abetted and whipped up about all of this, because it's so deeply ingrained in our DNA that somehow women have a different position, different and not equal. So the work continues, and the final point you make is such an important one. Any country that holds back women by norms, by law, by force, is just hurting itself. It is preventing half of its population from being full and productive contributors to the economy and to social progress. And when I say that, people say, well, not every woman wants to work. You know, I'm all for women making the choices that are right for them and their families, whatever those choices might be. And I am absolutely against anybody, by law, by norm, or coercion, preventing women from making the choices that are right for them.
Okay, now I'm going to be a tyrant. We have 2 minutes, but I'm going to make it 3 minutes. You three have 1 minute each. How do we get male allies on board? The great Billie Jean King said it has to be with men as well. So how do we get our male allies? President Bachelet.
Oh, well.
1 minute.
Well, silence is not my problem. I have never been silent in my life, but I try to be short. We need to show them how not only women win when women's rights are respected, but also their life will be much better. We need to teach them what Hillary was saying, how society will win, their children, their boys will win, but also the economy will win. Because men are very focused on economy many times. And we know that if women participate much more in the economy will triple. So we need to find the arguments to convince them. And I think we have enough arguments. And yesterday, in a meeting we had, Ambassador, yeah, I know, but okay, you give him much time.
We're giving her dispensation. We are moving, yeah.
The ambassador, Canadian ambassador, who is now the ECOSOC president, was saying the usual, argument of the misogynist says women has to find their place, and my answer, he said, is women have every place. They're here, they're there, they're everywhere and anywhere. And I think that's a great phrase. And we hear men like that speaking on behalf also of women's rights. I would say we will be able to accelerate the promise of Beijing. But I have to say, we're here because Beijing did have results. Yeah. The thing is, and we have to celebrate Beijing. Yeah. But also we need to understand we need to accelerate much more because we're so far away. And I'm thinking, maybe I will be a candidate for Secretary General.
Go ahead. Yes! Can I take that to the news? Breaking news? I'm going to report that. Me too. President Sirleaf. Yeah. No, I'm holding you to that. I'm holding you to it. President Sirleaf, you've got 30 seconds to tell me what makes you optimistic. Or a minute, two.
Pushback is historical. There has been progress of women. We need to use the data to be able to applaud where the successes is, shame the men, strengthen the women to be able to compete, to be courageous enough to go past their fears, to take on higher position. We in Africa know what it takes. We know that we're going to have the next woman president in just 10 days.
Where? And
we are aiming to have, in 10 years, at least 5 women president. And that's going to come because women want it.
I don't know if everybody...
Work hard for it. They're going to be courageous. We need for it to be done. Let's get all women of the world to jump behind the things we're doing, not only in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the United States, where we need it most.
Yes. Thank you. And I don't know whether you've heard, but in 10 days is the election in Namibia, which will bring us... So, inauguration. Sorry, you see, I'm completely out of the loop on this one. for you, the last question. Women waging peace. We talked about everything except peace, and that seems to me a dramatic necessity because everything's going to hell all at once.
Well, in this hyper-masculine world, where leaders dare say what they dare say, more than ever before, you need the women sitting at the table. Look at what happens in Afghanistan. Why is it that that happened? Because there were no women sitting at the table when the deal was closed.
No, it happened because the president at the time negotiated only with the Taliban and not with the elected government and handed the place back to the Taliban.
But that's part of not having women there. That's part of not having women, because women would have found a way to say, this is not kosher. And that's exactly what we need. We don't need to be necessarily confrontational, but we need to be loud and clear and stick to principles, to values, because that is what makes a difference, particularly when you want to build not only peace, you want to build peaceful, sustainable societies. And that is what makes the difference, the sustainability part, because you need to work day in and day out to make things sustainable. And guess who do that best? Women. And by the way, I am thrilled to hear Michelle saying that she might consider running.
No, she is running.
That's not what she said.
That's how Chinese whispers start.
That's what we were trying to get out of her. So this made my day.
Yeah, good. Thank you, everybody. What a masterclass. What a masterclass. We're going that way.
Please welcome back to the stage, Jennifer Klein. Please welcome back to the stage, Jennifer Klein.
Okay, I have nothing more to say after that. I just want to add that this has truly been an unforgettable gathering of women leaders who have changed and are still changing the world for the better. For them and for the panelists and moderators responsible for everything we've heard this amazing afternoon, can we please just give one more round of applause? And as we conclude this convening and prepare to go forward, galvanized by our speakers to press ahead, I want to just offer my deepest gratitude to everyone who's made today's gathering possible. Thank you to the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, GWL Voices, Vital Voices, and of course, Wellesley College. Thank you to our speakers for bringing such clear-eyed wisdom, energy, passion, and expertise, and for sharing it with us. Your vision, your dedication, and your work are literally changing the world for women and girls. And finally, thank you to the incredible staff at the Institute of Global Politics here at SIPA.